Martha had always been a respected figure in the community. At 68 years old, a widow for over a decade, she devoted herself entirely to the support group she coordinated at the church. There she welcomed people who needed a friendly word, helped with fundraising for needy families, and organized charitable events. Everyone admired her for her kindness and the firm yet gentle way she handled any situation. For many, Martha was a reference of strength and generosity. But for Thomas, her 9-year-old grandson, she was more than that. Since his parents had died in a tragic car accident 3 years earlier, she had become his only family, his protector, his beloved grandmother. Their routine was simple, but full of affection. Every morning before taking him to school, Martha would prepare a hearty breakfast and help him get dressed. Thomas, still sleepy, loved when she told stories about her youth while they were buttering the bread. "My mother always said that you need to start the day with a good meal and a grateful heart," she would comment, watching the boy chew slowly. Her gaze would always soften when she looked at her grandson, for she knew that despite being just a child, Thomas had suffered greater losses than his age should bear. He would return a discreet smile, because deep down he knew that his grandmother did everything to ensure he never felt alone. On weekends, Martha's house was bustling with members of the support group who came for meetings. They were people who, like her, carried scars from life, but found comfort in that small, welcoming circle. Thomas liked to stay nearby, listening to the conversations while scribbling drawings on the kitchen table. "Kindness is a gift that never runs out. The more we give, the more we have," his grandmother would often say during the meetings, and the boy absorbed every word as if they were valuable lessons. He felt safe in that cozy house, surrounded by stories and his grandmother's unconditional love. It was then that James began to appear frequently. James was Martha's nephew, the son of one of her deceased brothers. For years he had barely kept in touch, but now he seemed interested in reconnecting with the family. He was a 45-year-old man, well-dressed, always with a forced smile on his lips and a conversation that oscillated between exaggerated cordiality and an investigative tone. Thomas didn't like him. Maybe it was the way he touched things in the house without permission, or the way he looked at Martha, as if he were analyzing her instead of listening to her. But his grandmother, being the generous person she was, received him kindly, believing that he really wanted to re-establish family ties. "It's been so long since I've been here, Aunt Martha," James would say on his visits, walking through the living room and observing every detail. "The house is still the same, full of good memories." He would always compliment, but his gaze seemed to be searching for something specific. One day, noticing a shelf full of small sculptures and antique paintings, his eyes sparkled. "These pieces are impressive. I had never noticed them before." Martha smiled, picking up one of the small sculptures to show him. "They are memories from many years ago. Some belong to my husband, others I acquired over the years. Thomas loves to hear the stories behind each one." The boy, who was playing on the couch, looked up to see James holding one of the antique paintings. "This must be worth a fortune," the man muttered, observing the details of the painting. It was on that day that the visits became more frequent. James would show up unannounced, usually when Thomas was at school and the support group wasn't meeting. He claimed he wanted to spend more time with his dear aunt, but he always asked too many questions about the art collection. He wanted to know where certain pieces came from, if there were authentication documents, if any appraiser had ever given a real value to all of it. Martha, unsuspecting of his intentions, answered without reservations, explaining that she had never cared about the monetary value, only the sentimental one. Thomas began to notice that whenever James left, his grandmother would become pensive. He realized that something was wrong, because Martha would usually comment on her nephew's visits with an air of concern. "He was never very present before, but now he seems so interested in our family," she would murmur one night while organizing papers in the office. "Maybe he's trying to make up for the distant years." But the boy didn't share that confidence. To him, James didn't seem like someone seeking reconnection, but rather someone looking for something. The following week, James began to show an even greater curiosity. During one visit, he casually asked about the support group, mentioning that he had seen his aunt setting aside money for donations. "It must be difficult to manage all of this, isn't it, Aunt Martha? So much responsibility. And what if some money went missing? How would you keep track of it?" The question was asked in a joking tone, but something in the way he looked at her made Thomas feel a chill. Martha laughed, shaking her head. "I trust people, James. What we do here is out of love, and love always guides us to the right path." But after James left, Thomas noticed that his grandmother became restless, rearranging the notes about the group's finances. He knew she managed everything very carefully, but for the first time she seemed uncertain. That night, Thomas went to Martha's room and found her sitting on the bed, holding a small picture frame with a photo of his parents. She didn't immediately notice his presence, only sighing before saying, "Sometimes, Thomas, the people who should love us are the ones who hurt us the most." The boy approached and held her hand, feeling the concern in her gaze. "What happened, Grandma?" he asked, but she only smiled and kissed his forehead. "Nothing that love and truth cannot solve, my dear." He didn't fully understand those words that night, but days later, when he saw James once again lurking over his grandmother's documents, he began to realize that something was about to change. Martha's house had always been a haven of tranquility. However, with James's frequent visits, the atmosphere began to change in a subtle but worrying way. Thomas, attentive to everything, noticed that his uncle always found a way to be alone in some room of the house, especially in his grandmother's office. He said he needed to help with something. He would bring up conversation about the house's administration and expenses, but he always found an excuse to rummage through the drawers, look at the papers, or even open folders of documents that Martha carefully kept. One afternoon, while his grandmother was preparing tea in the kitchen, James took the opportunity to enter the office. The door was ajar, and believing no one was watching him, he began to search through the files. He pulled out folders, shuffled envelopes, and with a gleam in his eyes found a set of old documents. Among them was a detailed appraisal of the art collection belonging to the family. The papers contained estimates of value, provenance, and authenticity of the pieces, and the total indicated on the last page made his lips curve into a discreet smile. "This is worth more than I imagined," he muttered to himself, flipping through each page carefully. The more he read, the more he realized that his aunt probably had no idea of the fortune she had in her hands. Small sculptures, old paintings, rare ceramics. It was all there, untouched, gathering dust without being financially exploited. James closed his eyes for a moment, mentally calculating how much he could get if he sold the right pieces to the right buyers. Thomas, who was coming back from school at that moment, dropped his backpack on the couch and was surprised by the silence of the house. He went up the few steps leading to the hallway of the bedrooms, and as he approached the office, he saw James alone, holding the documents with an intense gaze. The boy frowned and instinctively took a step back, trying not to be seen. His heart raced and he felt a lump in his throat. Something was wrong. James closed the folder and put it back in its place, but not before quickly taking a photo of the papers with his cell phone. When he left the office, he came face to face with Thomas in the hallway, who pretended to be just picking something up from the floor. "Well, well, Thomas," said James, trying to sound friendly. "You got home early today, huh?" The boy just nodded, not knowing what to say. His instinct told him not to trust that man. In the following days, Martha began to notice small, strange details. During a support group meeting, while reviewing the financial records, she realized that the balance of donations was lower than it should be. At first, she thought she had made a calculation error, but after reviewing it again, she confirmed that money was missing. The amount was not exorbitant, but enough to cause her concern. "I think I need to review the records more calmly," she commented to one of the ladies in the group, frowning. "The money doesn't match the notes." Thomas, who was nearby, observed his grandmother's worried expression. He had never seen her make mistakes in calculations, and if something was missing, then there was a real problem. James, on the other hand, seemed increasingly comfortable in the house. His visits became routine, and he offered to help with small tasks, always finding a way to spend more time in the office. While Martha organized the support group's records, he discreetly manipulated the documents, moving papers around, inserting small false notes to create confusion. One day, while Thomas was doing his homework in the living room, he heard his grandmother sigh loudly in the office. "This doesn't make sense," Martha muttered, flipping through her records again. "I'm sure the balance was correct last week." She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her face. The boy got up and went to the office door. "Grandma, did something happen?" he asked, seeing her rub her tired eyes. "I don't know, my dear," she replied, looking at the papers. "It seems like the donation money is decreasing, but I can't understand how." Thomas felt a chill. He knew James had been tampering with the documents, but he had no proof. "Maybe someone took it without telling," he suggested carefully, but his grandmother shook her head. "I don't want to believe that, Thomas. This money is sacred, intended for those in need. But something is wrong, and I'm going to find out what it is." What Martha didn't know was that James was already one step ahead. He had not only tampered with the support group's documents, but had also begun to plant false evidence. Small deposits made into Martha's account, recorded in a suspicious manner, began to create a trail of irregularities. The intention was clear. When someone finally noticed the embezzlement, all suspicions would fall on her. That night, James stayed up later than usual. He waited until Martha and Thomas went to sleep, then returned to the office and rummaged through the papers again. He picked up a bank statement, scribbled a note next to an amount, and put the paper back in the folder. Then he took an envelope with money and discreetly tucked it inside the drawer that his grandmother used to keep her personal belongings. When he left the office, he crossed the corridor and saw Thomas's bedroom door ajar. The boy was lying down, but his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. James stood still for a moment, then smirked. "Good night, Thomas," he said, and his voice sounded strangely satisfied. The boy didn't respond. He just closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. The next morning, as she reviewed the records once again, Martha found the money envelope in the drawer. She frowned, surprised. "What's this doing here?" she muttered, picking up the envelope. She knew she hadn't kept it there. She looked around, confused, trying to remember if she had perhaps left it in the wrong place. But her instinct told her something was amiss. As he saw his grandmother restless, Thomas felt a weight in his chest. He wanted to say something, wanted to tell her what he had seen, but what if he was wrong? What if he was just imagining things about James? His grandmother trusted her nephew, believed in people's goodness, but he was sure James was not a trustworthy person. That day, when James showed up for another visit, Thomas noticed something different in his gaze. It was as if he was waiting for something, as if he knew his manipulations were working. And for the first time, the boy felt real fear of what was about to happen. The support group meeting was taking place as usual that afternoon. Martha, seated at the head of the table, listened attentively as one of the participants shared a recent struggle. The atmosphere was warm, filled with words of encouragement and hope. Thomas, sitting in a corner of the room with his sketchbook, doodled absent-mindedly, but paid attention to his grandmother. The boy always liked to hear her words, for he knew her kindness was genuine. However, that day, something was different. He felt a strange weight in the air, as if something was about to happen. The first sign came with the firm knocks on the door. The sound echoed through the room, interrupting the conversation. Everyone looked at each other, surprised, and Martha got up to answer. As soon as she opened the door, her face lost color. On the other side, there were two uniformed police officers with serious expressions. "Martha, we have an arrest warrant against you on suspicion of misappropriation and financial fraud." The words were spoken firmly, with no room for questioning. Silence spread like an electric shock through the room. The support group was paralyzed, unable to process what was happening. "This must be a mistake," said Martha, trying to stay calm. "I would never do something like that." But the officers were already moving. One of them pulled the handcuffs from his belt, while the other read the elderly woman her rights. Thomas jumped up, dropping his sketchbook on the floor. His eyes widened as he saw the officers holding his grandmother's arms. "No! What are you doing to her?" The boy ran to Martha, trying to hold her. "She did nothing wrong. You're mistaken." James, standing near the door, sighed loudly and shook his head with a look of false consternation. "This is so terrible. I never imagined it would come to this." The performance was perfect. Pretending surprise and sadness, he placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder as if to console him. "I'm so sorry, kid, but we must trust in justice." Martha turned to her grandson, her eyes full of concern, more for him than for herself. "Thomas, my dear, listen carefully. Everything will be all right. I promise." Her voice was calm, but her heart was tight at seeing the boy's despair. The officers pulled her towards the door. Thomas tried to hold her, but one of them gently pushed him away. "Grandma, no, please don't take her. She's innocent." The boy's scream echoed through the house, breaking the hearts of everyone present. Martha was taken to the patrol car under the watchful gaze of the community gathered in front of the house. The sound of the handcuffs closing echoed in the air like a final blow to her dignity. She tried to keep her head held high, but the pain in her chest was unbearable. She felt betrayed, humiliated, powerless. The cold night wind blew against her skin, bringing with it the bitter reality that her freedom had been taken away without mercy. Thomas, unable to bear what he saw, fell to his knees on the floor, sobs tearing at his throat. He wanted to run to her, prevent them from taking her away, but his legs seemed unresponsive. "No, Grandma!" His voice was a mix of despair and disbelief, but no one heard him. The officers, cold and indifferent, just closed the doors of the patrol car without looking back. James, standing beside him, sighed again, theatrically, and passed his hand over his face, pretending to be shaken. The dim light of the street lamps illuminated his tense features, but deep down, His eyes shone with something darker. A small, almost imperceptible smile appeared at the corners of his lips. He knew no one was paying attention to him. Everyone was focused on the dramatic scene unfolding before them, but inside his mind, the certainty of victory was growing stronger. His plan was working perfectly. He had finally managed to remove Martha from his path, and now all he had to do was ensure that no one dared to uncover the truth. Thomas felt his chest tighten as the patrol car carrying Martha disappeared in the distance. He could still hear the sound of his own screams echoing in his head, but no one seemed willing to listen to him. The people from the support group remained paralyzed, some exchanging incredulous looks, others bringing their hands to their mouths in shock. How could something like this happen? Martha had always been a pillar of the community, someone who dedicated her life to helping others. The idea that she could be involved in any kind of crime was simply absurd. James, with a calculatedly sad look, bent down beside Thomas and placed his hand on his shoulder. "I know this is difficult, boy, but you can't stay here alone. The police will investigate everything, and in the meantime, you need somewhere to stay." His voice came out with the false sweetness of someone who wanted to appear concerned. The boy, still sobbing, felt a chill run down his spine. "She didn't do anything, Uncle," Thomas whispered, wiping away his tears with the sleeve of his shirt. "They can't arrest someone who is innocent." His voice was choked, but carried an unexpected firmness for a child his age. James sighed, feigning deep regret. "I know, Thomas, but now we have no choice but to wait. Let's go to my house, at least for now." Thomas wanted to protest, wanted to shout that he wouldn't go anywhere without his grandmother, but he felt the weight of his uncle's hands on his shoulders and realized he had no choice. With a heavy heart, he let James lead him out of the house. The path to his uncle's car seemed far too long, as if with each step he was moving further away from the only person who truly cared about him. As James's car pulled away from Martha's house, news of her arrest had already spread. The church was nearby, and many of the faithful who attended the support group meetings began to appear, seeking to understand what had happened. People murmured, some shook their heads, others asked each other if it could be true. "Martha would never do such a thing," said an elderly woman, her eyes full of tears. "There must be some mistake." But not everyone thought so. Murmurs spread, doubts arose. If the police had come with an arrest warrant, were there any proofs? Could someone have deceived Martha? Or worse, was it possible the accusation was real? The initial shock was turning into uncertainty, and few were willing to defend someone who at that moment seemed guilty. That same night, Thomas sat in the back seat of James's car, watching the streets through the window, trying not to let the tears fall again. He remembered his grandmother's words, the firm look she gave him before being taken away. "It will all be all right," she said. But how could it? How could he believe that when he was being taken away from everything he knew and loved? When they arrived at James' house, Thomas realized it was a big place, but cold. Unlike Martha's home, which always seemed welcoming and full of life, there everything was too organized, with no signs of affection or comfort. James opened the front door and gestured for him to enter. "This will be your home for a while. I hope you feel comfortable." The boy entered slowly, looking around. The silence of the house seemed oppressive. There were no family photos on the walls, no smell of homemade food in the air. Everything there seemed impersonal, as if no one really lived in that place. James went to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and looked at Thomas over his shoulder. "If you need anything, let me know. Your grandmother will be detained until everything is resolved, but I'll take care of you. Now go take a shower and rest." Thomas didn't respond. He just nodded and walked to the room James had shown him. When he closed the door behind him, he felt the weight of loneliness in an overwhelming way. He threw himself on the bed, hugging the pillow and wishing, more than anything, that the night would end soon. He needed to find a way to help Martha. He couldn't leave her alone. He couldn't accept things staying that way. But as he thought of a plan on the other side of the house, James was pouring himself a glass of whiskey and smiling to himself. His plan was just beginning. The night seemed endless for Thomas. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the dark ceiling of the room which, despite being luxurious, brought him no comfort. The mattress was too soft. The sheets had a strange smell, and the silence of the place was disturbing. There was no sound of Martha's light footsteps in the hallway, nor the distant sound of the radio turned on in the kitchen, where she used to listen to her old songs. Everything there was cold, impersonal, as if he had been thrown into a world where he didn't belong. The digital clock by the bed read almost 3 in the morning, and Thomas was still awake, trying to control the tightness in his chest. He closed his eyes and saw Martha being taken away by the police, her anxious look, the firm voice saying everything would be all right. But how could it? How could he sleep while his grandmother spent the night in a cold cell, accused of something she would never do? He curled up under the covers, feeling his eyes burn with fatigue. He tried to think of a solution, but every thought came back to the same question: how to prove she was innocent. Despair grew inside him, and the only thing he could do was close his eyes tightly and murmur softly, "Grandma, I'll find a way to get you out of there. I promise." While Thomas struggled with insomnia, in another part of the house, James was busy. In the office where he kept files and documents, he was on the phone, his voice low and cautious. Yes, they're authentic and rare. He flipped through a notebook with hastily scribbled notes, scribbling values and quickly calculating the profits he could make. No, I can't sell them all at once. I need to be discreet. In his mind, everything was going according to plan. With Martha out of the way, he had complete freedom to do as he pleased. The art collection, previously locked safely in her house, was now partially in his possession, and each piece sold meant more money to solve his debts. He knew he needed to act with caution to avoid raising suspicions, but the desire for immediate profit was stronger than prudence. In the following days, James began to move the pieces. He carefully chose the buyers, people who wouldn't ask too many questions and who paid cash. Some sales were made in person, at discreet meetings, while others were intermediated by contacts he had in the world of collectors. Little by little, Martha's collection began to disappear without anyone noticing, or at least that's what he thought. Rose, an old family neighbor, always had a special affection for Martha and Thomas. A dedicated nurse and a straightforward woman, she found Martha's absence strange from the very first days. When she learned of the arrest, she felt a tightness in her chest. She had known Martha for years and knew that accusation didn't make sense. Since then, she began to closely observe what was happening around the house. It was thus that, one ordinary morning as she was leaving for work, Rose saw James carrying a framed canvas wrapped in cloth into the car. She frowned, feeling an immediate discomfort. That seemed a too careful transport for something unimportant. And why, all of a sudden, was he removing things from Martha's house? On the following days, Rose noticed more suspicious movements. James always left late at night, discreetly carrying objects, and returned a few hours later. Sometimes he received visitors who stayed for just a few minutes, exchanging envelopes and quick handshakes. Something was wrong, and Rose felt it in every fiber of her body. On the third consecutive night of these movements, Rose finally decided to act. She picked up the phone and called an acquaintance who worked at an art gallery. "I need you to do me a favor," she said, her voice firm. "See if any piece from Martha's collection has shown up for sale recently. I think something very wrong is happening." While Rose was taking her precautions, Thomas remained trapped in James's house, feeling increasingly alone. He noticed his uncle's behavior, the constant calls, the mysterious outings. He wanted to ask, but he knew James would always have a ready excuse. That night, as he lay down, Thomas felt a chill thinking about what would happen if no one discovered the truth in time. He needed to act. But how? How could a child face such a calculating adult? Unknown to him, Rose had already taken the first step to help, and the truth was about to begin to emerge. Thomas held the small visitor's badge tightly as he walked alongside James through the cold prison corridors. The freezing concrete floor, the pale walls, and the distant sounds of closing doors created a suffocating environment. The boy's heart beat fast, as if at any moment it would leap from his chest. He never imagined he would see Martha in that place. It was something that simply didn't make sense. When they reached the visitor's room, Thomas felt a knot tighten his throat as he saw Martha sitting on the other side of the table. She wore an orange uniform, her once well-groomed hair was disheveled, and her face seemed thinner than the last time he had seen her. But what struck him most was the presence of the handcuffs on her wrists. It was a small detail, but it made everything even more real, even more cruel. "Grandma!" The boy ran to the table, hastily pulling the chair and holding her hands as soon as he could. Martha's fingers were cold, fragile, and he felt his eyes burn with contained tears. Are they treating you well? Are you eating properly?" His voice was low but charged with emotion. Martha forced a tired smile and stroked her grandson's hand. "I'm fine, my dear, don't worry about me." But Thomas saw in her eyes that this wasn't true. She was exhausted, and the injustice of her situation weighed on her shoulders. James, who until then had been standing beside them, crossed his arms and let out an impatient sigh. "We have little time, Thomas. Better get straight to the point and ask what you want." His voice was calculatedly cold, as if he already wanted to shorten the visit before it even began. The boy ignored James and leaned closer to his grandmother. I know you didn't do anything, Grandma. I'm going to get you out of here, I promise. The words came out full of determination, but he felt the pain in his chest as he saw his grandmother's gaze soften, as if she didn't want him to carry this weight. Martha squeezed his hands and smiled sadly. You're a very good boy, Thomas, but I don't want you to worry about this. Trust that the truth always finds a way to appear. James looked at his watch and tapped his fingers on the table, impatient. That's enough. Let's go, Thomas. He pulled the boy's chair before he could say anything else. Thomas resisted, still holding his grandmother's hand, but one of the guards approached, signaling that the visit was over. With eyes full of tears, Thomas felt Martha's fingers slip from his as if a piece of his soul was being torn away. The prison's visitors' room seemed larger and colder at that moment, each concrete wall reinforcing the insurmountable distance between them. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the metal of the bars was suffocating, and the distant sound of doors closing echoed like a definitive sentence. As James dragged him out, the grip on his arm was firm, but Thomas barely felt it. His heart was beating too hard. His mind refused to accept what was happening. He turned his face quickly, desperate for one more moment by his grandmother's side, as if it were the last. Martha remained seated, her frail hands resting on the worn table. Her orange uniform seemed even more disproportionate on her thin body, but her smile persisted, even though her gaze said otherwise. There was something there, something only Thomas could understand. Her eyes, still full of tenderness, concealed a silent plea. They begged for something no one else could do, find the truth. The boy bit his lip to hold back sobs and clenched his fists. At that moment he made his decision. He wouldn't let his grandmother rot in that place. If no one else had the courage, he would. He would find the truth, no matter what it cost. The days that followed the prison visit were long and silent for Thomas. The image of Martha sitting in that cold room, wearing the orange uniform and handcuffed, wouldn't leave his head. He felt powerless, suffocated by the injustice. James seemed satisfied, acting as if he were merely fulfilling a duty by taking care of his nephew. But Thomas knew something was very wrong. It was on a grey afternoon, while James was in the office, that Thomas noticed an unexpected opportunity. He was in the hallway waiting to be called for dinner when he saw the glow of his uncle's cell phone screen on the coffee table. The device was unlocked, something rare, since James always made sure to keep it protected. Thomas felt his heart race. He knew he wouldn't have much time. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the hallway to make sure James wouldn't suddenly return. He picked up the cell phone with trembling hands, trying to be as quick as possible. He slid his finger across the screen, opening the recent history. His stomach churned as he saw there were several messages exchanged with an unknown number, accompanied by videos and photos. With a hesitant tap, he opened one of the videos. The muffled sound filled the room, and he quickly lowered the volume. In the video, James was sitting in a restaurant, talking to a man Thomas had never seen before. "This needs to be quick," James said, leaning forward. "The collection is already partially sold, but there are still some pieces left. If not now, it may be too late." The man on the other side of the table nodded, fiddling with a wad of cash. "Are you sure there are no records that could compromise the sale?" The woman didn't keep receipts, nothing. James chuckled softly, shaking his head. She never cared about that. For her, those pieces had sentimental value, but for me, they're pure money. Thomas felt his blood run cold. It was the proof he needed. Right there before his very eyes was confirmation that James was selling Martha's art collection, and worse still, that he had planned it all from the beginning. The boy swallowed hard, feeling his sweaty hands grip the phone tightly. He needed to save that video. He needed to find a way to show someone, but fear paralyzed him for a few seconds. What would James do if he found out he was messing with the phone? What if he deleted the evidence before Thomas could use it? He was about to try sending the video to himself when a soft but concerned voice called out his name. "Thomas?" The boy jumped, nearly dropping the phone. He turned and saw Rose standing in the doorway, watching him with a furrowed brow. Her eyes immediately caught the tremor in the boy's hands and the frightened expression on his face. She closed the door behind her and approached cautiously. "What happened? Are you okay?" Thomas looked at the phone and then at Rose, feeling his chest rise and fall with rapid breaths. He knew he could trust her. Without much thought, he held out the device to the nurse, his eyes filled with unshed tears. I found this on James's phone. He's lying. He's selling Grandma's stuff." Rose took the phone and looked at the screen. As soon as she saw the video, her face hardened. She listened to the conversation intently, and at the end took a deep breath, carefully closing the phone screen. When she raised her eyes to Thomas, Her expression was no longer just one of concern. It was one of determination. "We need to find a way to keep this safe," she said, keeping her voice low. "If James finds out we've found this evidence, he might try to get rid of it." Thomas nodded, still trembling. Rose knelt in front of him and held his hands firmly, trying to calm him down. "Listen, boy, you did the right thing. Now we have something that can help your grandma. But we have to be very careful. Understand?" Thomas took a deep breath, trying to regain control of himself. He nodded again, and Rose squeezed his hands before offering a small, encouraging smile. "We're going to save Martha, Thomas. I promise." The boy frowned, feeling the fear grow again. "But what if it takes too long? My grandma is trapped. What if something happens to her?" His voice faltered on the last word, and Rose felt her heart tighten. Martha was a strong woman, but she was in a cruel environment, surrounded by people who had nothing to lose. They needed to act soon, but without mistakes. She brushed the boy's hair back and spoke with a firm but affectionate voice. "I know it's hard to wait, my dear, but we need to be smart. We'll prepare everything before taking this to court, but I promise you, we won't leave Martha alone in this." Thomas took a deep breath and clenched his fists. For the first time since his grandmother had been taken away, he felt that someone was truly on his side. He trusted Rose, and even though he was afraid, he knew they needed to follow her plan. From that moment on, they were allies. And together, they would do everything to bring the truth to light. Rose didn't waste time. As soon as she ensured the video was saved and protected, she began looking for a way to see Martha as soon as possible. She knew her situation in prison wouldn't be easy, and any sign of hope could help her stay strong. Using her contacts and reputation as a respected nurse, she managed to schedule an extra visit, claiming she needed to check on Martha's health. When she received confirmation, she breathed a sigh of relief, but knew the most important part was yet to come. Thomas could barely contain his anxiety at the thought of seeing his grandmother again. Since his last visit, the image of her handcuffed in that orange uniform hadn't left his mind. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone. But above all, he wanted her to know that he was fighting for her. When they finally arrived at the prison, the boy's heart felt like it was about to leap out of his chest. As they entered the visiting room, he saw Martha sitting at the table waiting. She looked even thinner than before, and the weariness in her eyes was evident. But when she saw Thomas, her face lit up with a faint smile, as if for an instant all that oppressive environment disappeared. The boy ran up to her, holding her hands tightly. "Grandma, I promise I'll get you out of here. I swear. I found something that can prove you're innocent." His voice was heavy with emotion, and Rose felt a pang in her chest at the intensity in the boy's eyes. Martha squeezed his hands and smiled tenderly, despite her evident suffering. "My love, just the fact that you're here gives me strength, but be careful. You're just a child, and I don't want anything bad to happen to you." She looked at Rose with a grateful and concerned gaze. "I know you're helping him. Thank you." Rose nodded firmly. "We're going to get you out of here, Martha, I promise. We have evidence against James. We just need the right moment to act." Martha took a deep breath, seeming to absorb those words. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe there was still hope. She looked at Thomas, and her heart swelled with pride. "You've always been a strong boy, my dear, and now you're being even stronger. But I want you to know one thing. No matter what happens, I'll always love you." Thomas squeezed her hands even tighter, as if he could hold her there, as if he could prevent that moment from ending. The warmth of Martha's hands, even fragilized by time and injustice, was the only thing still keeping him standing. His eyes were blurred by the tears he tried to contain, blinking rapidly to push them away. But the lump in his throat made every word difficult to say. "I know, Grandma, but you won't stay here forever. I won't let you." His voice trembled, weighted down by a determination greater than any fear he felt. Martha smiled, and that smile was both a balm and a sharp pain. It was an attempt to calm him, to give him strength, but Thomas saw beyond that. He saw the weariness in her eyes. He saw the injustice that corroded her. He saw the hope that, no matter how resilient, became an ever thinner thread. Before they could continue, one of the guards approached, his expression impassive and his voice cold. "Time's up." Thomas felt despair rise like a wave, engulfing everything around him. He didn't want to let her go, didn't want to leave knowing she would be alone, but Martha cupped his face tenderly, her thumbs caressing his cheeks with affection. "Believe in the truth, my love. It always wins." In that moment, Thomas knew. He knew that no matter what he had to face, no matter how many obstacles arose, he would do anything to keep his promise. Rose knew James was not a trustworthy man, but as the days passed, her intuition told her he was more desperate than he appeared. If he was selling off Martha's collection, then he needed quick money. And no one gets rid of something that valuable unless there's a major debt behind it. Determined to better understand the situation, she began investigating. With her experience as a nurse and years living in the neighborhood, Rose had contacts in many places. By talking to the right people, she discovered that James had been drowning in financial troubles for a long time. Accumulated debts, failed businesses, and bad bets had led him to a critical state. One of Rose's contacts, who worked at a bank, confirmed that James's bank account was nearly drained and that he had taken out substantial loans in recent months. More than that, there were records of him trying to renegotiate some of those debts recently, which meant he was trying to buy time. That explained a lot. James not only wanted to get rid of Martha's collection out of greed, but because he had no choice. If he didn't pay what he owed, he could lose everything and might even be in danger. Rose knew this information could be valuable, but she still needed more evidence before exposing everything. While Rose sought details about James's debts, Thomas noticed changes inside the house itself. He had already noticed that his uncle was constantly going out at night and receiving discreet visitors, but now the signs were even more evident. Paintings that once decorated the hallways had disappeared, and some shelves where sculptures used to be were now empty. The boy wandered through the rooms, trying to remember exactly which pieces were missing. In a corner of the room, he noticed marks on the wall, where a large painting his grandmother adored once hung. The empty space seemed glaring, a reminder that something precious had been ripped away from there. He felt his heart race and bit his lip, trying to contain his nervousness. It was no longer just a suspicion. James was really selling the collection, piece by piece. That night, Thomas waited until James left again. With careful steps, he went to his uncle's office and peeked through the crack in the door. The desk was full of papers, and some envelopes seemed to have been left in a hurry. He took a deep breath and approached, picking up one of the papers. His eyes widened as he read the words bank transfer and confirmed purchase. Several items listed there seemed familiar. He held the paper tightly, feeling a mixture of fear and anger. He needed to tell Rose. There was no more doubt. James was getting rid of Martha's collection as fast as possible, and if they continued without acting, soon there would be nothing left to recover. James had always considered himself smart enough to manipulate situations in his favor, but something had started to bother him in recent days. He noticed that Thomas was different, quieter, too observant. Before, the boy walked around with his head down, clearly affected by his grandmother's absence. But now there was a different gleam in his eyes. It was as if he was waiting for something, planning. Moreover, Rose's constant presence began to bother him. The nurse had always been close to Martha and Thomas, but lately she seemed more interested in knowing about the household routine, asking questions he preferred not to answer. It was obvious that she was suspicious of something, and that irritated him. He needed to act before she became a problem. That afternoon, while Thomas was in his room pretending to study, James crossed his arms and stared at Rose with a cold look. "I think your presence here has been enough, Rose. We no longer need daily visits." His voice was dry, cutting, and the way he pronounced the words made it clear that this was not a request, but an order. Rose did not let herself be easily intimidated. She kept her expression firm and raised an eyebrow. "I'm here for Thomas, James. He's going through a difficult time. Do you really want to deprive him of the only person besides you who cares about him?" James let out an ironic laugh and shook his head. "He has me, and that's enough. I don't need you roaming the house, asking questions and filling his head with unnecessary things." He took a step closer, leaning slightly. "From now on, you're not coming in here anymore. And if I find out you're trying to turn Thomas against me, I can assure you the law will be on my side." Rose felt her blood run cold, but she kept her composure. She knew that confronting him at that moment was not the best choice. She took a deep breath and nodded slightly, as if she were yielding. "Very well, James, if that's how you want it, I respect that." But inside, she knew she was now closer to the truth than ever. Thomas, who had listened to the conversation hidden behind the door, felt a knot in his stomach. He knew Rose was his only ally, and now James was pushing her away. He needed to act quickly. With silent steps, he returned to his room and took the tablet that Rose had given him to keep the evidence. He knew that if James suspected anything, the first thing he would do would be to search his things. He looked around, trying to decide where to hide the device. Under the mattress? Too obvious. Inside the drawer. James could search it. His eyes landed on the school backpack in the corner of the room. Carefully, he placed the tablet at the bottom, between the notebooks, and closed it tightly. Then he pushed the backpack under the bed. where it looked just like another forgotten object. Now all that was left was to wait. James was suspicious, but Thomas knew he couldn't let fear stop him. He would do whatever it took to protect the evidence and save Martha. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest as he heard James talking on the phone in the living room. He had his back turned, holding a glass of whiskey while talking to someone in a low but firm tone. "Yes, I understand. So soon? Is there no way to postpone it?" There was a pause, and then James sighed heavily, rubbing his temples with his fingers. "All right, I'll take care of this before it becomes a problem." Thomas didn't need anything else to understand. Martha's trial had been moved up. He felt his blood run cold, as if time had run out faster than expected. Without a second thought, he ran to the bathroom, locked himself in, and took out the cell phone Rose had secretly given him. With trembling fingers, he typed a short message. "The trial has been moved up. What do we do?" Minutes later, Rose replied, "We've found our moment. We need to act before James destroys the evidence. Meet me at the market tomorrow." That night, Thomas could barely sleep. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders seemed overwhelming, but he couldn't fail. If they didn't reveal the truth at the right moment, Martha could be wrongly convicted. The next morning, he managed to leave the house claiming he needed to buy school supplies. James, too busy with his own worries, just waved his hand, not paying attention. Thomas seized the chance and ran to the market, where he found Rose already waiting. The nurse bent down to be at his level and firmly held his shoulders. "Thomas, listen carefully. At the trial, they will try to make it seem like your grandmother is guilty, but we have the proof. At the right moment, you will stand up and tell the truth. I'll be there with you." The boy swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words he had just said. His heart was pounding, but he couldn't back down now. He looked at Rose with determination, the resolve growing inside him like a flame that could not be extinguished. "I can do it, Rose. I won't let my grandmother pay for something she didn't do." His voice came out stronger than he expected, as if in that moment he was maturing years in a matter of seconds. Rose kept her gaze fixed on him, evaluating every feature of his face. The fear was still there, impossible to ignore, but above that there was courage, a courage that many adults would never have. She squeezed his hands tightly, feeling the energy that boy carried. "Then it's decided," she said with a grave but confident tone. "On the day of the trial, we'll put an end to James once and for all." The silence that followed was dense but not uncomfortable. It was the calm before the storm. Martha's fate depended on them, and failure was not an option. Rose and Thomas were ready to face whatever it took to ensure that the truth was finally heard. Martha was growing weaker. Prison was a cruel environment, and the weeks there were beginning to take their toll. She felt her body more tired with each passing day. The meals were insufficient, and the cold nights made her shiver, even when she tried to cover herself with the thin blanket in her cell. Her thoughts constantly turned to Thomas. How was he? Was he eating properly? Feeling safe? These questions haunted her more than the incarceration itself, but what worried her even more was the uncertainty. Would she have the strength to wait until the truth came to light? While Martha struggled against time inside the prison, James was more impatient than ever. With the trial anticipated, he needed to act fast. If the investigations advanced before he managed to get rid of all the pieces from the collection, he could end up in a difficult position. He intensified the sales, finding buyers who didn't ask too many questions. During the last days, he was often going out, carrying boxes wrapped in fabric, entering and leaving discreet meetings. Thomas began to notice that besides the paintings that had already disappeared, now sculptures and other smaller objects were also missing. Each piece that vanished was another blow to Martha's memory, another sign that James didn't intend to leave anything behind. The boy tried to pretend he didn't notice, because he knew that if James suspected his watchful eye, he could take more severe actions. But the revolt grew inside him like a tight knot. Thomas's nights became a torment. The nightmares were constant, always involving Martha. He dreamed that he arrived too late, that she looked at him through the bars, begging for help, but he couldn't reach her. On other nights, he saw James laughing while tearing up the papers with the evidence, destroying any chance of freeing her. Every time he woke up, he was covered in sweat, with rapid breathing and a pounding heart. One of those nights was particularly cruel. In the dream, he saw the courtroom full of people. He tried to speak, tried to show the video, but his voice wouldn't come out. The judges ignored him. Martha was taken to a dark cell and James smiled victorious. When he woke up, he felt a suffocating despair. He couldn't fail. He needed to do something before it was too late. The next morning, seeing James rushing out carrying another painting, Thomas was certain that time was against him. If they didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to recover. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine when he heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. He was in the room pretending to read a book, but something in the way James moved around the house alerted him that something was wrong. The door burst open, slamming against the wall, and James entered with the tablet in his hands, his eyes sparking with anger. "What is this, Thomas?" His voice was low, but filled with restrained fury. He raised the tablet, shaking it in the air. "What have you been up to?" The boy's heart raced. He knew this could happen, but he didn't expect it to be so fast. He needed to think of something, but before he could answer, James was already swiping his finger across the screen, opening the files. The man frowned as he saw the video saved there, the clear proof of his betrayal. His eyes narrowed and he turned slowly to Thomas. "So that was it?" He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you can unmask me?" The anger in his voice was rising, and Thomas felt his muscles tense. But then, something unexpected happened. James tried to open the video and a message appeared on the screen. "File removed from the cloud. Backup saved on another device." For a moment, James's face froze. He pressed his lips as if trying to control his rage, but his fists clenched. "Rose," he muttered, almost spitting out the name. "She already saved everything, didn't she?" Thomas remained silent, but the silence was enough to confirm James's suspicion. The man took a deep breath and ran his hand through his hair, trying to think. Then he turned to the boy and smiled in a frightening way. "Well done, Thomas. If you want to play this game with me, then I'll play too." He crossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. "You like this house, don't you? You like the school, the friends? Well, if you continue with this nonsense, I'll make sure you never see any of that again." Thomas felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't look away. "You can't stop me from seeing my grandmother." His voice came out firmer than he expected, and that only seemed to irritate James even more. "Oh, but I can." He stepped back, walking slowly around the room, as if savoring his own words. "If you keep trying to harm me, I'll send you to a boarding school, a very far away one where no one can help you. You'll be stuck in a place where neither Rose nor your grandmother nor anyone can get you out." The boy felt his legs tremble, but he didn't give in. "I know what you did, James, and even if you send me away, Rose will still have the video. You can't erase the truth." James stopped and stared at him, his eyes shining with frustration. For a moment he seemed to consider something, but then he smiled calculatingly. "We'll see, Thomas, we'll see who wins this game." He left the room, slamming the door behind him. Thomas slumped his shoulders, trying to catch his breath. The fear was there, growing inside him. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to give up. Thomas spent the following minutes sitting on the bed, his heart pounding against his chest. James's words still echoed in his mind, the threat of the boarding school hanging over his head like a blade about to fall. But despite the fear, he felt something different inside himself. A fire growing, an absolute certainty that he couldn't give up. If he did, Martha would never leave that prison. He needed to talk to Rose. He picked up the cell phone she had given him and typed a short message. He found the tablet. He's furious. "Said he's going to send me to a boarding school." He sent it quickly and waited, his fingers gripping the edge of the device. Time seemed to drag on until finally the reply came. "Don't worry, my dear. I've already hidden all the evidence." He can't erase the truth. That phrase was like a weight lifting from his chest. Rose had already taken precautions, as always. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling a renewed strength. He wasn't alone. That night, Rose acted more cautiously than ever. She knew James was cornered, and that men like him became even more dangerous when they realized they were about to lose. She kept copies of the video in different locations, a well-hidden USB drive at her house, another copy sent to a trusted contact, and to be sure, a scheduled email to be sent automatically if anything happened to her. Thomas, in turn, made a firm decision. He would not let James win. He walked to the bedroom mirror and stared at his own reflection. His eyes were tired, but there was determination in them. "I won't let him destroy Grandma. No matter what happens, I'll fight to the end," he whispered to himself. And at that moment he felt he was taking on a greater responsibility than any child should bear. The next day, Rose managed to talk to Thomas at school. He ran to her as soon as he had the chance, and the nurse bent down to hold his hands affectionately. "You were amazing, boy, but now we need to be smarter than ever. The trial is coming, and we're going to end this charade." Thomas clenched his fists, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. His heart was beating fast, but he couldn't hesitate. "I'm ready, Rose. At least I need to be. My grandmother needs me." His voice was firm but carried an undercurrent of nervousness. Rose smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "She has more than that, Thomas. She has a brave, determined grandson, someone who doesn't run from the truth, and together, we'll win. We'll show that justice still exists." The night before the trial, Rose sat beside Thomas holding his small hands firmly. They were at her house where he would be hidden from James until the next day. The boy maintained a rigid posture, his eyes laden with tension and fatigue. The reality of what was to come weighed on him, but the nurse knew she needed to strengthen him for what would come in court. "Thomas, tomorrow will be a very difficult day," Rose began, watching his reaction closely. "You'll see many people who want to convince the judge that your grandmother is guilty, but you need to remember what is true. You have something no one else has, the truth, and that's what will save Martha." The boy took a deep breath, feeling his heart race. He knew that moment would be crucial, but there was still fear. "What if they don't believe me, Rose?" The question came out as a whisper, laden with insecurity. Rose gently squeezed his hands and smiled. "You have more than your word. You have evidence. The video, the documents, everything has been saved and will be presented at the right time. And more importantly than that, you have courage." Thomas looked at her and nodded slowly. He knew Rose was right, but that didn't diminish the knot in his stomach. While Rose was strengthening Thomas for the trial, James was elsewhere, celebrating his victory in advance. At a discreet restaurant, he was toasting with an acquaintance. The satisfied smile never left his face as he slowly swirled the glass in his hands. "Tomorrow it all ends," he said confidently, bringing the whiskey to his mouth. "The trial will be quick. The evidence against Martha is solid, and that boy can't do anything. At most, he'll cry and kick, but no one takes a 9-year-old boy seriously." The man across from him, a buyer who had already acquired some pieces from the art collection, laughed low and raised his glass in a toast. "So, you mean the collection is finally yours without any strings attached?" James smiled sideways and shook his head. "It's already mine. I'm just getting rid of the bureaucratic details." He leaned his arms on the table and sighed with pleasure. "The money is rolling in, the sales continue, and when everything is resolved, I can move on without anyone in my way." To him, the trial was just a formality. The city was already convinced of Martha's guilt, and without someone to defend her with concrete evidence, her conviction was inevitable. On the other side of the city, in her cold cell, Martha stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of hopelessness. Her hands, thin and frail, rested on the thin blanket of the hard bed. The prison's cold seemed more intense that night, but what really consumed her was the silence. She thought of Thomas, the pain he must be feeling. He was just a child, and yet he was facing something that even many adults could not endure. Would he be able to bear it all? Would he find a way to save her? She tried to push away the negative thoughts, but reality was cruel. She knew how these trials worked. Justice was not always on the side of truth, and her situation was not favorable. James had built an almost perfect trap, and the odds were against her. She closed her eyes and sighed, feeling her chest tighten. If this was really the end, she only hoped that Thomas would not be left alone, that he would find someone to take care of him. That night, while James celebrated and Martha sank into hopelessness, Thomas, alongside Rose, made a silent decision. He would face the court, and no matter what happened, he would not let his grandmother pay for a crime she did not commit. On the morning of the trial, Thomas woke up early, his stomach churning with nervousness. He sat on the bed, taking deep breaths as he looked at the ceiling. The day he had so feared had arrived. In a few hours he would be in front of the court, facing adults who would try to make Martha seem guilty, but he couldn't back down. It was his only chance to save his grandmother. Rose was already awake, organizing papers and reviewing the evidence they had. When Thomas appeared in the room, she smiled at him, trying to convey confidence. "Today is a big day, Thomas. Are you ready?" The boy hesitated for a second before nodding. "I have no choice, do I?" His voice was small but firm. Rose knelt down beside him and held his hands. "You do have it, my dear. You always have. But I know you won't give up, because your grandmother needs you. And we have something that no one else has, the truth." Thomas took a deep breath and nodded, feeling his heart beat fast. "And when should I speak? What do I do if they won't let me show the video?" The nurse took a folder and opened it, showing the order in which the court proceedings would be conducted. "We will first hear the charges, then the prosecution's witnesses, including James. They will try to make Martha look guilty. But when it's time for the defense, you need to be ready. We can't interrupt everything just anyhow, because if we do it too early, they may prevent us from using the evidence." Thomas frowned, absorbing the information. "So I have to wait until the right time?" Rose nodded. "Yes. When James gives his testimony, He'll likely try to portray himself as the victim, saying he only wants justice for the family. That will be the right moment to act. You need to stand up, speak clearly, and say you have something important to show, and I'll be by your side. The boy felt his heart race. The idea of speaking in front of so many people, of publicly challenging James, terrified him, but he had no alternative. He looked into Rose's eyes and clenched his fists. I'll do it. I won't let my grandma be condemned. As Rose and Thomas prepared, something was happening at the church Martha had attended for years. The news of her arrest had spread quickly, and many community members were outraged. Some still had doubts, influenced by the news and talk about the supposed evidence against her, but many others didn't believe Martha was capable of such cruelty. That morning, dozens of people gathered at the church to pray for her. Men and women who had been helped by Martha over the years, people who knew her well enough to know that this accusation was unjust. Some held signs with messages of support, while others organized a silent vigil in front of the courthouse. An elderly man who had attended the church for decades raised his voice before the crowd. I've known Martha for years. She helped my family when we were going through difficulties. She would never take money from anyone for her own benefit. She always gave, never took. Many heads nodded in agreement. A woman with teary eyes added, she helped me when I had nowhere to live. She gave food to my children when we had nothing. If she's in jail, it's because someone set her up. The commotion was great. Even those who had doubts began to wonder if they really knew the whole truth. The support grew by the minute, and the movement in front of the courthouse was starting to draw attention. Thomas didn't know that so many people were on his grandmother's side, but at that moment, even without seeing them, he felt he wasn't alone. He took a deep breath and looked at Rose. Let's end this. The nurse smiled and adjusted the clothes he was wearing. Yes, Thomas. Today is the day of truth. The night before the trial seemed to drag on endlessly. Thomas was sitting on the bed, holding a photo of Martha in his hands. It was an old picture, taken before everything fell apart. In it, his grandmother smiled at the camera with that welcoming look that always made the boy feel safe. But now, thinking of her wearing that orange prison uniform, the pain became unbearable. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Please, God, help Grandma, he whispered, holding the photo against his chest. She didn't do anything wrong. She just wanted to help people like she always did. Give me strength to do what I need to do tomorrow. I don't want to fail her. The words came out with difficulty, caught by the lump in his throat. Thomas wasn't someone who usually prayed, but at that moment there was nothing else he could do but trust that the truth would prevail. He quickly wiped his eyes and looked at the photo once more before placing it under his pillow. Tomorrow everything would change. He just hoped it would be for the better. In the other room of the house, Rose was sitting at the table, reviewing the documents one last time. With each paper, each piece of evidence arranged in order, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The truth was there, ready to be revealed, but the risk was still great. James was cunning, manipulative. If he had the chance, he would try to turn everything against them. She picked up her phone and reviewed the recorded video again, ensuring all copies were intact. She made notes, making sure every argument they would use was clear. The next day there would be no room for errors. For a moment, Rose stopped and rested her head in her hands. She felt the accumulated fatigue of the past few weeks, but she couldn't allow herself to falter. Thomas needed her. Martha needed her. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, James was in an elegant bar, drinking alone at a reserved table. The glass of whiskey swirled between his fingers, the ice clinking softly against the glass. He smiled to himself, satisfied. Tomorrow it all ends, he murmured, bringing the drink to his lips. He didn't see how he could lose. The evidence against Martha was solid, and with the rushed trial, there was no time for any flimsy defense to be built. He shook his head and laughed as if amused by fate. Martha was always naive. She thought kindness was enough to win, but the real world doesn't work like that. He finished the last sip and signaled to the waiter, ordering another drink, this time unhurried. The ice clinked in the glass, reflecting the bar's warm yellow light, and James leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. He deserved to celebrate. After all, the next day he would ensure that Martha would be forgotten behind bars and that the family's entire fortune would be in his hands. He felt untouchable, the architect of a perfect plan. What James didn't know was that while he was toasting his supposed victory, Rose and Thomas had already prepared the final blow. The clock ticked slowly towards dawn, the moment when everything would change. When the sun rose, it wouldn't be Martha facing justice, but him. And this time there would be no excuses, lies, or easy ways out. The truth was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The courtroom was packed. The murmur of conversations spread through the room as people took their seats, eager to see the outcome of a case that had already become one of the most talked about in the city. The judge entered and everyone stood up, the sound of the gavel echoing as he called for silence. In the center of the room, Martha was led to the defendant's bench. The orange uniform seemed even heavier on her thin shoulders, and the tired look reflected weeks of suffering. Thomas was sitting next to Rose, his sweaty hands gripping the fabric of his pants. He watched everything, his heart pounding against his chest. The tension was suffocating. Even knowing the truth, he saw how frail his grandmother looked in that environment. It was as if justice had already decided her fate before even hearing her version. The prosecution began by calling the witnesses for the accusation. The first to testify was an employee of the bank, where Martha made the financial transactions for the support group. The man, wearing an impeccable suit, went to the witness stand and adjusted himself before beginning his testimony. The bank transactions made by the defendant indicate irregular movements of large sums. Deposits of money were made into her personal account, coming directly from the church support group's funds, he declared confidently. In addition, there were attempts at transfers that suggest a systematic misappropriation over the months. Martha kept her head held high, but Thomas saw how her hands were trembling on the table. He knew those proofs were manipulated. James had created a false trail to incriminate her, but for the court it seemed convincing. Then they called James to testify. He walked to the witness stand with calculated steps, wearing a well-fitted dark suit. He sat down with a serious expression, his eyes lowered as if he carried an unbearable weight. "This has been a nightmare for me," he began, pausing briefly, as if containing emotion. "Martha has always been a kind woman, but after I started reviewing the family's finances, I realized something was wrong. I tried to confront her, tried to understand why she was misappropriating money, but she denied everything. It was then that I realized I had no choice but to seek the truth." Thomas clenched his fists. Every word from James was a lie, but he spoke with such calm, such assurance, that he even seemed sincere. The judge nodded for the prosecution to proceed. "So, Mr. James, you claim that your aunt was using the support group's money for her own benefit?" the prosecutor asked, feigning a neutral tone. James nodded slowly. "Unfortunately, yes. And when I saw that the bank records confirmed this, I understood that she needed to be held accountable. It wasn't an easy decision for me. After all, she's family." He sighed and looked at Martha, staging a forced remorse. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to absorb all that sham. Thomas felt anger growing inside him. How could that man lie so brazenly? The prosecution then presented the concrete evidence, bank statements with suspicious transfers, Martha's signatures on financial documents, records indicating the movement of money from the community fund to her personal account. Everything seemed solid. The judge analyzed the papers for a few seconds and adjusted his glasses. "The evidence here is quite direct," he commented. "Mrs. Martha, do you wish to speak before we move on to the defense?" She raised her eyes and took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I never used a single cent from the support group for myself. I don't know how these documents were altered, but I would never betray the trust of the people who depend on that money." Her voice was firm, but the strain was visible. The prosecutor laughed subtly, shaking his head. "We understand your position, Mrs. Martha, but the facts say something else. Mr. James presented detailed information and documentary evidence. What does the defense have to say about this?" Thomas felt his body freeze. The moment was approaching. He looked at Rose, who nodded subtly. Their plan had to be perfect. If they failed, Martha could be convicted right there. The tension in the room increased. Everyone was convinced of her guilt, but no one expected that in the next instant, a 9-year-old boy would break the silence and change the course of that trial. The courtroom was silent, the tension weighing on everyone as the supposed evidence against Martha was presented. The judge flipped through the documents, shaking his head slightly, as if he had already made his decision. James, sitting on the witness stand, maintained a controlled expression, but his eyes shone with the certainty of victory. It was at that moment that Thomas felt he could no longer wait. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed to echo in his ears. If he didn't act at that instant, everything would be lost. He abruptly stood up from his chair and shouted, his childish voice, but fraught with despair. "Don't arrest my grandmother, I beg you. She's innocent." All eyes turned to him. The judge frowned, surprised, and the prosecutor turned with an irritated look. "Boy, this is not your moment to speak." But Thomas was not intimidated. His eyes were filled with tears, but his determination was unbreakable. He pulled the tablet out of his backpack and held it firmly in his hands. "I have proof. I can prove my uncle is lying." A murmur took over the room. People began to whisper, surprised by the boy's audacity. The judge banged his gavel against the wood, trying to restore order. "Silence in court. Who is this child and who allowed him to be here? This is a serious trial, not a spectacle." James stood up from his chair, his face turning pale for a moment before recomposing himself. "Your Honor, this is my nephew. He's confused. He doesn't know what he's saying." Rose, who had been waiting for this moment, stood up next to Thomas and raised her voice. "He knows exactly what he's saying. Thomas has proof that James is secretly selling Martha's artworks. He set all this up to incriminate her." The courtroom exploded into even louder murmurs. The prosecutor turned to the judge, clearly bothered. "Your Honor, this is an unacceptable disruption. The court cannot be conducted in this manner." The judge observed Thomas, who was now clutching the tablet to his chest, breathing heavily. There was something about that boy that made him hesitate. He didn't seem to be lying. "If you say you have evidence, boy, you need to present it now. Otherwise, I will order you to be removed from the courtroom." Thomas nodded vigorously and ran to the judge's bench. His hands were shaking as he unlocked the tablet. Rose followed closely, making sure nothing went wrong. "Look at this!" Thomas tapped the screen and the video began to play. The clear audio echoed through the courtroom, revealing the recording of James conversing with an unknown man in a restaurant. "This needs to be quick," James said in the video. "The collection is already partially sold, but some pieces remain. If not now, it might be too late." The murmurs increased. Some people widened their eyes, others turned to James, who was now visibly sweating. In the video, the buyer responded, "Are you sure there are no records that could compromise the sale? The woman didn't keep receipts, nothing?" And then the most incriminating part, James laughed and replied with a tone of contempt. "She never cared about that. For her, those pieces had sentimental value, but for me, they're pure cash." The courtroom erupted. The judge had to bang the gavel several times to try to contain the chaos. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but no words came out. James's expression had changed completely. The control he had maintained until then was crumbling. Martha, who had been watching silently until then, put a hand to her chest, unable to believe what was happening. Her eyes, once filled with fatigue, now shone with hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The judge raised his hand, demanding order in the court. "Mr. James, what do you have to say about this recording?" James opened his mouth, but quickly closed it. His face turned red, and beads of sweat trickled down his forehead. He looked around, searching for an exit, but there was nowhere left to run. Rose approached Thomas and placed her hand on his shoulder. "The truth always comes out," she said, looking directly at James. "And now the court can finally see who the real culprit is." James squirmed in his chair, his gaze alternating between the judge and the exit door as if considering fleeing. But before he could make any move, one of the court officers was already approaching. Thomas felt his body tremble with relief. He did what he promised his grandmother. He brought the truth to light. And now Martha would finally have her chance to be free. James, trying to regain control of the situation, quickly stood up and pointed at Thomas with feigned indignation. "Your Honor, this boy has no idea what he's saying. He's just a child influenced by emotions. This is an outrage." Thomas felt his body shudder with anger, but Rose placed a calming hand on his shoulder before looking at the judge. Her posture was firm, her voice laden with authority. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Thomas is the only person in this room who has had direct access to the real evidence in this case. He can prove that Martha is innocent and that James is manipulating everything to incriminate her." The prosecutor, who until then had seemed comfortable with the conduct of the trial, cleared his throat and looked at the judge. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the testimony of a child cannot be considered solid evidence without proper analysis." The judge interlaced his fingers on the desk and looked directly at Thomas, assessing his expression. He saw something different in the boy. There was conviction in his eyes. This was not a child throwing a tantrum. It was someone desperately fighting for justice. The courtroom was filled with murmurs and shocked reactions. People whispered to each other. Some turned to look at James while others exchanged incredulous glances. Martha, who had been watching silently until then, covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. The judge banged the gavel forcefully. "Silence in the courtroom!" He turned to James, his expression now loaded with suspicion. James, once so confident, was now visibly pale. His eyes darted from side to side, searching for an exit. Then his expression changed. In an abrupt movement, he slammed his hands on the table and pointed at Thomas, anger spilling over. "This is a setup. That video was edited. This child is lying." His voice echoed through the courtroom, but instead of conviction, all that could be seen on people's faces was disbelief. The court officers were already approaching, ready to act if necessary. The judge raised one hand, ordering James to calm down. "Control yourself, Mr. James, or I will have to order your detention for contempt." But James was no longer in control. He stood up entirely, pounding the table forcefully. "This is an outrage. I won't let a kid ruin everything." He began to advance, his furious eyes fixed on Thomas, but before he could take another step, the officers grabbed him by the arms. "Let me go. This court is making a mistake. I'm the victim here." James struggled, but the officers held him firmly in place. The judge took a deep breath, observing the scene before him. He turned to the prosecutor, who was silent, clearly unsure how to react. "It seems we have crucial new information for this case. I order that this recording be analyzed immediately. In the meantime, the court will recess." The murmurs took over the room again, but now the shock was evident. Everything had changed in an instant. Thomas looked at Martha, who stared back at him with eyes full of emotion. For the first time since it all began, there was real hope. And James, once confident, was now about to face the consequences of his own lies. The courtroom was quieter when the judge returned after the recess. All eyes were on him, awaiting the decision that could change everything. Thomas held Rose's hand tightly, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. Martha, still wearing the orange jumpsuit, maintained her dignified posture, but her eyes carried the hope that had seemed to fade weeks ago. The judge adjusted his glasses and banged the gavel, calling everyone's attention. After analyzing the recording presented by the defense, this court concludes that there are serious indications of evidence tampering and financial manipulation. He turned to James, who was now sitting with a hardened face, his fists clenched on the table. "Mr. James, the evidence indicates that it was you, not Martha, who benefited from the embezzled funds, and that this accusation was a deliberate attempt to cover up your own crimes." A murmur took over the room. Some people in the courtroom exchanged surprised looks. Others shook their heads, shocked by the revelation. The prosecutor, visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat and stood up. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, we request the dismissal of the charges against Martha and the immediate opening of an investigation into James." The judge nodded and turned to Martha. "The charges against the defendant are officially withdrawn. Martha, you are free." For a moment it seemed that time had stopped. Martha covered her mouth with her hands, unable to believe it. Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he ran towards his grandmother and hugged her tightly. "I told you I would save you, Grandma." He sobbed against her shoulder, feeling all the weight of the tension finally crumbling down. Martha cupped her grandson's face and smiled, her eyes welling up. "My dear, you were so brave, You never gave up on me." Meanwhile, the guards were already moving towards James. The judge motioned for him to stand up. "Mr. James, in light of the evidence against you, I order your immediate arrest for investigation of fraud and false accusation. You will be taken into custody until a new hearing." James stood up abruptly, his eyes filled with fury. "This is a mistake. You can't do this to me." He turned to the prosecutor but found no support. "I'm the victim here. That brat rigged everything." The guards didn't give him a chance to react. In a matter of seconds, handcuffs were placed on his wrists. The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed. James, who had so carefully planned to see Martha jailed, was now the one being taken into custody. But the twist didn't stop there. When the bank employee who had previously testified against Martha was called again, something unexpected happened. Sitting on the witness stand, he took a deep breath, looking uneasy. He looked at the judge, then at James, and finally lowered his head. "Your Honor, I need to tell the truth. James paid me to forge the bank statements and fabricate evidence against Martha." The confession came quickly, as if he wanted to get rid of a massive weight. "He said that if I did this, no one would suspect him. I agreed because he threatened me. But now I see that I was part of something terrible." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and shocked exclamations. James, who was still trying to fight his arrest, turned with hatred in his eyes. "You idiot! You should have kept your mouth shut!" The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. "This confession only confirms the charges against James. This court will adjourn this session with the assurance that all frauds committed will be investigated and punished according to the law." Rose looked at Thomas and smiled, pride written all over her face. "We did it," she said, gently squeezing the boy's shoulder. And in that moment, As James was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Thomas felt for the first time in weeks that justice had finally been served. The moment Martha was declared innocent felt like a dream to Thomas. For weeks he had lived with the fear that he would never see his grandmother free again, but now in front of everyone, she was there without handcuffs, without that orange jumpsuit, ready to go home. The boy couldn't hold back his tears and ran towards her as soon as the guards made room. "Grandma!" Thomas's voice came choked, laden with all the emotion contained in the last few days. He threw himself into her arms, holding her tightly, as if afraid that it was all just a nightmare and that at any moment she would disappear again. Martha enveloped him in a tight embrace, burying her face in her grandson's hair. She could smell his familiar scent, mixed with the dust of the courtroom and the adrenaline of the moment. Tears streamed freely down her face, but this time they were not of sadness or despair. They were of relief. "My boy, my brave boy," Martha whispered between sobs. "You saved my life, Thomas." Thomas looked at her, hastily wiping his eyes. "I promised I wouldn't leave you alone, Grandma. I would never leave you." Rose, who watched the scene with an emotional smile, approached and placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. "He did more than that, Martha. He faced everything to prove your innocence. He was a warrior." Martha looked at Rose with gratitude in her eyes. "Rose, I don't know how to thank you. I know you stood by Thomas the whole time, protecting him, helping him find a way. I have no words to express how grateful I am." Rose held Martha's hands and gently squeezed them. "I did what any decent person would do, but Thomas was the one who had the courage to challenge an entire court to bring the truth to light." Before they could continue the conversation, a noise from outside the courthouse caught everyone's attention. When they went out through the main doors, they found a crowd waiting outside. People were holding up signs with messages of support. Members of the church had gathered, and the emotion was visible on every face. "Martha, we always believed in you," shouted an elderly woman in the middle of the crowd, her eyes brimming with tears. "You didn't deserve what happened," added a man, waving a sign that read, "Justice for Martha." Emotion took over the atmosphere. Some people started to applaud, while others approached to offer words of support. Martha, who had spent the last few weeks feeling isolated, not knowing how many still believed in her, was paralyzed by that display of affection. Thomas looked around, surprised. "They really believed in Grandma?" Rose smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Of course. Martha did so much for this community, and now it's everyone's turn to give back." Martha felt the tears return to her eyes, but this time there was no pain in them. She smiled, holding Thomas's hand tightly as she absorbed all that affection. "I thought I had lost everything, but now I see that I was never alone." A priest from the local church approached, holding a small prayer book. "Martha, we never doubted your kindness. You have helped us so much over the years. Now it's our turn to stand by your side." Thomas watched everything, feeling a warmth growing in his chest. For weeks he had felt alone, as if no one believed him or his grandmother. But now, seeing all those people gathered, he realized they had never been truly alone. Rose looked at Thomas with a proud gleam in her eyes. "You not only saved your grandmother, boy, you showed this community that the truth always wins." Martha hugged her grandson to her once more. "And I could never have done it without you, my love." Applause filled the atmosphere, and for the first time in a long time, Martha and Thomas felt they could breathe a sigh of relief. They had won. The following days after the trial brought immense relief for Martha and Thomas, but also revealed the true impact of James's scheme. The news of his arrest spread quickly, and as the investigations progressed, more details about his frauds began to emerge. The police found hidden bank records, illegal transactions, and fraudulent contracts he had used to embezzle money from the family. Additionally, the buyers of the artworks began to appear, bringing information about the sales made by James in recent weeks. Some pieces were already in other states, but most were recovered before they could be resold on the international market. Thomas and Martha were called to see the recovered pieces. When they entered the warehouse where they were stored, Martha felt a tightness in her chest as she saw her collection again. They were objects that represented memories, each painting and sculpture having a special meaning. "I thought I'd never see this again," said Martha, gently running her hand over one of the frames. "James tried to erase our family's history, but the truth always finds a way back." Thomas looked around and smiled with relief. "Now everything can go back to the right place, Grandma. These pieces have always been yours." Meanwhile, James, now out of options, finally gave in and confessed everything. During a new testimony to the police, he revealed the real motivation behind the crime. He was drowning in gambling debts. In recent years, He had spent everything he had trying to recover losses, but the situation got out of control. When he realized there was no way to pay, he saw Martha's art collection as an easy way out. "I had no choice," he said coldly, sitting before the investigators. "Either I got the money or they would come after me. Martha's collection was my only chance to escape." But nothing justified what he did. He not only robbed his family, but tried to destroy his aunt's life to cover up his mistakes. Now he would face the consequences of his actions. The bank fraud was also completely unmasked. The bank employee, pressed by the evidence, confirmed that he had altered the financial records at James's behest, in exchange for money to keep silent. With this confession, the court formalized the complete annulment of the case against Martha. Justice had finally been served, and with that, Martha and Thomas could finally begin to rebuild their lives. When Martha and Thomas crossed the threshold of the house, an indescribable feeling overcame them both. The home, which once seemed empty and cold, was now a symbol of resistance. Everything James had tried to destroy was being rebuilt, and every corner of that house carried the history that had almost been erased. Martha took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. The familiar smell of the place, even after weeks away, was still there. She slid her fingers over the stair railing, feeling the texture of the wood, as if to make sure all of this was real. Thomas ran inside, his eyes shining as he saw the boxes with the recovered paintings. "Grandma, look." He pulled one of the frames, revealing a painting that had always hung in the living room before James sold it. It was Martha's favorite painting, a portrait of her family in happier times. She walked over to him and gently ran her hand over the canvas, her eyes welling up. "I thought I'd never see this here again, my love." Her voice came out choked, loaded with emotion. With the help of Rose and some neighbors who volunteered to help, the artworks began to be returned to their rightful place. One by one, the paintings went back on the walls, filling the house with the essence that had been stolen. Each recovered piece was a piece of restored dignity. As they were organizing everything, the doorbell rang. Thomas ran to answer, and upon opening the door, found some neighbors standing there with embarrassed looks and nervous hands. A lady, who always attended church meetings, was the first to speak. "Martha, we came to apologize." Her voice trembled slightly and she clutched her hands, hesitant. "We were unfair. We should have trusted you more, but we let James's lies deceive us." One of the neighborhood men, who had always praised Martha, scratched his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I feel like a fool for believing that scoundrel. You've always helped us, and when it was your turn to need it, many of us stayed silent." Martha, who had been watching them in silence until then, smiled gently. Her heart held no resentment. "We all make mistakes, but the most important thing is to learn from them." The neighbors nodded, relieved by the welcome. "If you need anything at all, we're here for you." Thomas watched it all up close and felt his chest warm. After everything they'd been through, realizing that the community still cared was a relief. That night, seeing the paintings back on the walls and feeling the house alive again, Martha and Thomas knew they had won. Justice had been served, and now finally they could start over. The next morning, Martha woke up feeling something that had long seemed distant: peace. The sun came in softly through the window, lighting up her room in a welcoming way. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't surrounded by bars, didn't have to worry about interrogations or looks of distrust. She was home, where she had always belonged. As she got ready, she felt a mix of anxiety and happiness. Today was an important day. She would return to the support group at the church, the one she had helped build and which for a time seemed to have turned against her. But there was no resentment in her heart. She knew that many had been manipulated by James's lies, and now she had a chance to start over. Thomas accompanied her to the church. He seemed different, lighter. Since the day of the trial, the boy had started smiling again like before, as if all the weight he had been carrying had finally dissipated. He held his grandmother's hand as they walked, and Martha felt that this simple gesture said it all. They had gone through the worst together and came out stronger. When they arrived at the community hall, the looks that were once of doubt were now of admiration and affection. As soon as she entered, Martha was greeted with tight hugs and emotional words. One of the women in the group held her hands tightly, her eyes full of tears. "Martha, how we missed you. We don't know how we let James deceive us. You have always been the soul of this place." Another gentleman, who used to organize charity events alongside her, shook his head, clearly remorseful. "It took seeing you wrong to realize that we should never have doubted you." Martha smiled, feeling her heart warmed. "What matters is that we are here now, together. I don't want to look at the past with bitterness, only to move forward and continue helping as we always have." The group applauded, and soon the meeting continued with the same welcoming energy as before. Martha felt that she was exactly where she belonged. Thomas watched it all with a gleam in his eyes. He didn't know how much it meant to his grandmother until he saw her there, surrounded by affection and respect. For the first time since it all began, he felt that life was really getting back to normal. At the end of the meeting, Rose appeared, bringing coffee for everyone. Since the trial, she had become a constant presence in Martha and Thomas's home. She always checked if they were okay, helped however she could, and more than that, she had become part of the family. When he saw her, Thomas ran up to her with a broad smile. "Rose, you came." She ruffled his hair affectionately. "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss this moment for anything." Martha approached and held the nurse's hand. "I don't know what we would have done without you. If Thomas is my angel, you were the guardian that God put in our path." Rose laughed, moved. "Well, it seems like I'm stuck with you two now, but I don't mind. I think I like being part of this family." Thomas looked at Martha and then at Rose. "And I like having you around." At that moment, all the wounds that James had tried to open began to heal. Life went on, but now with even more love and unity than before. Time passed, but Martha didn't let the scars of injustice define her life. On the contrary, she used her experience to transform suffering into something greater. With the support of the church group and the community, she began working on a project to help other people who, like her, had been wrongly accused and had no one to defend them. The weekly meetings of the church group now had a new purpose. In addition to helping those in need of assistance, Martha began to listen to stories of people facing false accusations and not knowing how to defend themselves. She guided them, referred them to volunteer lawyers, and above all, offered hope. "I know what it's like to be on the other side, to have everyone pointing their finger without even hearing your side of the story," Martha said at one of the meetings. "But I learned that the truth always finds a way to come out, and no one deserves to fight alone." Thomas watched his grandmother with admiration. Before, he saw her as someone strong, but now he understood that her strength came not only from resilience, but from the desire to make a difference in others' lives. The boy had also changed. After everything he went through, he matured in a way that few boys his age could understand. He was no longer just a scared child trying to save his grandmother. He was someone who believed in justice and knew that sometimes it took courage to face it. On a quiet day at their house, Rose noticed this change. As she helped Martha organize papers for the new project, she looked at Thomas and smiled. "You've grown a lot, you know? Not just in size, but in here." She pointed to his heart. Thomas smiled back, no longer shying away from such praise. "I think now I understand what it means to fight for someone. Before I thought it was just a matter of telling the truth, but I learned that sometimes people don't want to listen. We need to make them see." Martha approached and hugged her grandson, feeling pride overflow in her chest. "And you did that, my love. You saved me, and now we're helping so many other people." The transformation that James had tried to prevent happened in an even grander way. Martha and Thomas not only regained their lives, but made them a beacon for those who still needed to find their own justice. A year later, Martha and Thomas's life was completely different. Time had passed quickly, but the scars of injustice were not forgotten. They were transformed into strength. On that sunny morning, the neighborhood church was fuller than ever. Colorful banners decorated the entrance. Tables laden with homemade dishes filled the hall, and laughter echoed through the space. The community had organized a grand celebration, and the main honoree of the day was Martha. News of her project to help the wrongly accused had spread, and her story was now a symbol of overcoming. People who once doubted her were now there to acknowledge their mistake and pay due respect. Thomas ran through the hall, helping to arrange the last details. He had grown a lot that year, not only physically but in maturity. Now he was seen as a brave boy, someone who faced the impossible to save his grandmother. He looked around and smiled to see that place, once filled with gossip and mistrust, now overflowed with gratitude and affection. When Martha arrived, accompanied by Rose, the entire hall erupted in applause. She took her hand to her chest, moved, unable to contain her tears. She never imagined she would live to see a moment like that, where she was not judged, but celebrated. The church priest walked to the center of the hall and took the microphone. "Today, we are here to recognize a woman who has always done everything for this community, even when that same community abandoned her. Martha was the victim of an injustice, but instead of sinking into resentment, she chose to forgive and continue helping others. That is true strength." Applause echoed again. Some people in the audience held handkerchiefs, moved by the words. Martha, still surprised by the tribute, looked at Thomas, who smiled and nodded positively. The priest continued, "For everything you have done and continue to do, it is with great honor that we present this plaque of recognition for services rendered to the community." A woman from the organization brought a golden plaque where it was written, "Martha, symbol of justice and hope." Martha held the award with trembling hands and looked at everyone around her. "I don't know what to say, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice, when accompanied by faith and courage, always wins. And I didn't do this alone. My grandson Thomas was the true hero of this story." Everyone applauded, and Thomas, blushing, ran to hug his grandmother. Rose watched them closely, smiling. The party continued with music, food, and joy. On that day, there was no longer a shadow of injustice, only the certainty that Martha and Thomas had found their happy ending. After the tribute at the church, Martha and Thomas were surrounded by hugs, kind words, and gratitude. But in the midst of the celebration, something even greater was growing inside Thomas. He watched his grandmother being recognized not only as a victim of injustice, but as someone who transformed her pain into hope for others. And at that moment, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. At the end of the party, as they walked together to the house, Thomas looked at Martha and Rose with a different gleam in his eyes. He took a deep breath and with a firm voice said, "Grandma, I've decided I want to be a lawyer." Martha stopped and blinked a few times, surprised. "A lawyer?" She smiled, but waited for him to continue. Thomas nodded, holding his grandmother's hands. "Yes, I want to help people like you who are wrongly accused. I know what it's like to see someone you love being treated like a criminal without having done anything wrong. If I can prevent that from happening to other families, I want to do that." Martha felt her chest fill with emotion. For a moment, her heart tightened, remembering everything he had gone through to get there. Her grandson was no longer just a child who faced the court with courage. He was someone who had found a purpose. Rose, who was walking beside them, smiled and put her hand on the boy's shoulder. "That doesn't surprise me at all. You have a fighter's soul, Thomas. You'll be an amazing lawyer." Thomas looked at Rose with gratitude. "You also helped me see that the truth needs a voice. If it weren't for you and my grandmother, I wouldn't have made it." Martha held her grandson's face in her hands and looked deeply into his eyes. "My dear, you're already an inspiration. And if this is your choice, know that I'm prouder of you than anything else in this world." Thomas smiled and hugged her tightly. "I'll do everything I can to never let anyone go through what you went through, Grandma. I promise." In the following months, Thomas began to study with even more dedication. If before he saw studies as something mandatory, now he saw it as a path to his dream. He began to follow more closely the cases Martha helped with, learning about laws and injustices, and whenever he could, he asked Rose everything, who encouraged him to move forward. Rose, by the way, never left their lives again. Over time, she became a permanent part of the family. She was present at every dinner, every important gathering, and became a second mother to Thomas. On a quiet night, as they dined together, Martha looked at Rose and smiled. "You know this house is yours too, don't you?" Rose held Martha's hand with affection. "It always has been, Martha. From the moment you let me help, I knew I didn't want to be anywhere else." Thomas looked at the two of them and smiled. He never imagined that everything would end up like this. But looking at his happy grandmother, Rose there with them, his bright future ahead, he knew he had not only found justice, he had found his true family. That night, after dinner, Martha called Thomas into the living room. The house was quiet, the soft glow of the lamps reflecting on the paintings that had returned to the place where they should never have left. Martha looked at each one of them with a mixture of nostalgia and relief. "Come here, my love," she said, motioning for Thomas to sit next to her on the couch. He approached, curious. Martha pointed to one of the paintings on the wall, an old canvas with vibrant colors and delicate strokes. "This was the first painting your grandfather gave me," Martha said, smiling affectionately. "It was a birthday present, many years ago. He used to say that art would always have a special place in our family because each piece tells a story." Thomas observed the painting carefully, absorbing every detail. "And what's the story of this one?" Martha sighed and looked at her grandson. "The story of a love that survived everything, of a couple who went through difficult times, but never gave up on each other. Your grandfather and I built this house, this home, and this collection was always what reminded us of what really matters, what we feel, what we live, and who we love." Thomas smiled and looked around. "I think I understand now. These paintings aren't just beautiful, they're a part of you." Martha nodded. "And now they're a part of you too. When I'm no longer here, I want you to take care of them. But not just the paintings, my love. I want you to take care of our story." The boy moved closer and hugged his grandmother tightly. "You'll always be here, Grandma, because love doesn't disappear." Rose, who was watching the scene from the kitchen, smiled emotionally. That home, which had once been taken over by pain and injustice, was now filled with love and redemption. At that moment, Martha knew that everything they had gone through was not in vain. Her grandson was safe, her family was complete, and the truth had prevailed. The art collection was back in its place, but the true treasure of the house was not the paintings. It was the family, more united than ever. The courtroom was packed on the day of James's final trial. Unlike the first trial, where he appeared as a respectable, family-concerned man, he was now handcuffed, wearing a prisoner's uniform, with a dejected look, and not a trace of the arrogance he once flaunted. The time in prison while awaiting his sentence had left its marks. His hair was disheveled, the dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and his hands were restless, clenching his fists tightly. On the other side of the room, Martha and Thomas were seated together, observing every detail attentively. Rose was beside them, her expression firm. She wasn't there for revenge, but for justice. She wanted to see the man who destroyed so many lives finally pay for each of his crimes. The judge entered the courtroom and ordered silence. As soon as everyone was settled, the prosecutor was the first to stand up. He looked directly at James, and his voice sounded strong and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we are here to ensure that a dangerous criminal is punished for his actions. James is not just a man who committed financial fraud. He manipulated, betrayed, and destroyed lives to gain advantages. His crimes go far beyond a simple diversion of money. He forged documents, framed an innocent person, used his position to deceive justice, and committed fraud repeatedly." James remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He knew there was no way out, but he still didn't want to accept the fate that was about to be sealed. The prosecutor continued, picking up some documents and displaying them to the court. "Here we have proof that James forged signatures, manipulated bank records, and illegally transferred funds from the community support group to his personal account. He also illegally sold an art collection that didn't belong to him, deceiving buyers and creating a fraudulent scheme that caused damage not only to his own family, but to several people involved." Martha watched every word with a mixture of relief and indignation. She already knew it all, but hearing it out loud, before justice, reinforced the gravity of what James had done. "Furthermore," the prosecutor continued, turning directly to the defendant, "James coerced a bank employee to help him forge documents, threatening to expose personal secrets and putting third parties at risk. His behavior was premeditated and cruel. He did not hesitate to frame his own aunt, manipulating evidence so that she would be unjustly imprisoned, all so that he could take control of the money and settle his gambling debts." James closed his eyes for a moment upon hearing this last part, not because he regretted it, but because he knew he was cornered. Then a new witness was called, the bank employee who initially helped James forge the documents. He entered the courtroom nervous but determined to tell the truth. Sitting on the witness stand, he took a deep breath before beginning. "I knew what I was doing was wrong, but James threatened me. He said that if I didn't alter the records, my career would be over. He paid me to modify the bank statements, to make it look like Martha was embezzling money when it was him all along." Murmurs took over the room. The judge banged his gavel. "Silence in the courtroom." The employee looked at James, who avoided making eye contact. "I regret having helped, but now I'm here to ensure the truth is told." The prosecutor nodded and then called the next witness, one of the buyers of the art pieces James illegally sold. The man, in an impeccable suit, sat down and looked directly at the defendant. "When I made the purchase agreement with James, he assured me that the pieces were legally available. I paid a very high price for paintings that belonged to his aunt, without knowing he was deceiving everyone. After the truth came out, I filed a lawsuit to recover the money, but it was too late. He had already used a good portion to cover his gambling debts." The prosecutor returned to the center of the courtroom, closing the papers on the table and taking a deep breath before concluding his speech. "Your Honor, James committed crimes of bank fraud, forgery of documents, fraud, perjury, witness coercion, money laundering, and trafficking of stolen goods. All of these crimes together not only harmed his family, but an entire community. He manipulated justice, used his intelligence to deceive honest people, and tried to destroy his own aunt's life, all out of greed. The state requests that he be sentenced to the maximum penalty provided for each of these crimes." The judge listened attentively, keeping a neutral expression while flipping through the documents. After a few seconds of silence, he turned to James, "Do you have anything to say before I announce the sentence?" James finally looked up, his expression hardened but without a shred of remorse. "Nothing I say will change what you've already decided, will it?" He let out a bitter laugh. "The truth is, I just played by the rules this world gave me. If I hadn't been caught, I would have won." Martha closed her eyes and shook her head. Until the end, James continued to believe that everything boiled down to winning or losing, without understanding the real weight of the lives he had destroyed. The judge showed no emotion in the face of the defendant's words. "Very well. In light of the evidence presented and the gravity of the crimes committed, this court sentences James to 20 years in prison under a closed regime, with no possibility of parole until at least 15 years have been served. Additionally, he will be required to reimburse the financial losses caused to the victims." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the gavel striking. The verdict had been given. James had fallen completely. The guards approached to take him back to prison. Thomas watched it all with a mixture of satisfaction and relief. His grandmother was finally free, and the man who had tried to destroy her would pay for every one of his crimes. As James was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs, the doors closing behind him, it was clear to everyone that this time he had nowhere left to run. Justice had been served. James entered the maximum security penitentiary, feeling a weight in his chest that he had never experienced before. Throughout his life, he had been a skilled manipulator, always finding ways to evade the consequences of his own actions. But now, faced with the immensity of the iron gates and the shadowy corridors of the prison, he realized that his reign had come to an end. Here, he had no control, no allies, no money to buy his way out. As he walked through the corridors, he felt the inmates' gazes upon him. Each gaze carried something different: curiosity, contempt, even hunger for revenge. Everyone there had already heard of him. After all, cases like his always drew attention. A wealthy man who deceived his own family to escape gambling debts, being convicted and thrown into the same place where other criminals he once despised were. In here, he was nothing more than another number. James was led to his cell where he found his prison mate, a bulky, heavily tattooed man who barely glanced at him before lying back down on the metal bunk. The thin, stained mattress offered little comfort, and the moisture in the environment made the musty smell unbearable. James swallowed hard. There was no more luxury, no more power, only cold walls and bars separating him from the world. On the first day, he tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but quickly understood that the hierarchy was different in there. During lunch in the cafeteria, he grabbed his tray and sat away from the others. But before he could take the first bite of the bland food, one of the inmates pulled the tray from in front of him and looked at him with a malicious smile. "I heard you're an important man out there, but in here you're worth nothing," the other said, taking a piece of James's dry bread and chewing it slowly. James felt his rage grow, but knew reacting in there was dangerous. He looked around and realized no one would do anything. There were no rules in prison, at least not for him. The hierarchical system among the inmates was clear. The strong dominated, the weak obeyed, and he wasn't strong in there. In the following days, the humiliation only increased. He was forced to do the dirtiest chores in the block, from cleaning the communal bathroom floor to carrying heavy boxes for the more influential prisoners. The guards cared little about what happened between the inmates, as long as there were no major disturbances. To them, James was just another convict trying to survive. The nights were the worst. Lying on the hard mattress, he could barely sleep. He heard the muffled screams of other inmates in fights, the whispered threats down the hallways, the metallic sounds of bars closing. Fear became his only companion. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. The days dragged on. James realized that, contrary to what he expected, no one came to visit him. There were no lawyers trying to overturn his sentence, no friends willing to help him. He was completely alone. It was only after a few weeks that he understood the true weight of what he had done. During yard time, he overheard a group of inmates talking about him. "This guy robbed his own family. He put his own aunt in jail to save his skin," one of the inmates said, spitting on the ground. "That's what I call cowardice," another added. "In here, we may have done bad things, but at least we have a code. We protect our own." That guy betrayed his own blood. James knew that in prison, certain types of criminals were seen as the worst kind of scum, and he fit into that category. There were murderers, traffickers, robbers, but few had committed a crime as despicable in the eyes of the other inmates as his. There was no respect for those who deceived their own family. That night, as he tried to eat dinner without drawing attention, one of the inmates sat next to him and banged on the table hard. "You thought you'd fool everyone, didn't you? That you'd get away with it like you always did out there? James didn't respond. He kept his gaze fixed on the food, trying to ignore the provocation, but the other inmate laughed and leaned in even closer. In here, we don't like traitors. You better learn that quickly, before prison teaches you the hard way. James couldn't finish his meal that night, or the following nights. The months passed, and he began to waste away. Without money, influence, or power, there was nothing left he could use in his favor. Gradually he realized that the fate he had imposed on his own aunt was becoming his own torment. The irony of the situation weighed on him every day. In the past, he had laughed at Martha's naivety, thinking her kindness made her weak. But now it was he who was behind bars, forgotten by everyone, despised even by the worst criminals. Deep down, James knew there was no turning back. He would spend the rest of his days there, feeling on his skin everything he had tried to impose on others. And for the first time in his life, James experienced regret. Not because he wanted to change, but because he finally understood that in the end he hadn't won. He had lost everything. Did you like the story of Martha and Thomas? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one, waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.